Okay, hello everybody, welcome. My name is Priit Liivak and I'm talking about cultural dimensions. This won't definitely be a very technical talk, but it will hopefully be a very beneficial talk for anybody who works in a distributed team setup. So how many of you currently work in a team that have people from multiple cultures? Would you please raise your hand? So pretty much all of you. So how many of those teams are distributed across multiple geographies as well? Okay, so that's a good place to be right now for you then. Okay, and why I'm talking about this is because the world is becoming increasingly distributed, and as you can see, most of you work in distributed team setups. In software, in architecture, we've managed to overcome that. We have microservices, various different patterns to kind of adopt to this distribution. We have tools that support that. We have infrastructure changes, movements to the cloud that help to provide this kind of distributed solutions. But the truly challenging or difficult part is actually people. So how do we as developers have actually changed over the past years to kind of perform better in this kind of distributed setups? That's the question I'm hopefully inspiring you to research further after this talk. I am sharing my learnings and observations on this topic. So this is not very scientific, but it has a scientific background as well. So there will be a few studies I will be mentioning. But first, let me share a bit about myself. Who am I to talk about these things? I have been in Nortal for 12 years and covering various roles, been a team lead, architect, and currently in the role of head of engineering. A few personal facts. I'm one of the persons who doesn't find the word programmer offensive. And I don't mind pizza. I don't mind pineapple on pizza, so I don't especially like it either. But that's who I am. And over these 12 years, I worked in various geographies. So this is pretty much everywhere where Nortal is operating in. The chart does not cover Africa, where I've also participated in a project. But it has a lot of Nordics. Also, I've worked with teams in Lithuania, in Serbia, in Romania, in Oman, and most recently also in USA, specifically in the Seattle area, that is. So I kind of gained this understanding or feeling that things are different in those development teams where I worked with. And from that, I gained motivation to look more into this topic. So first thing that I understood was that development teams in multiple geographies understand even simple words very differently. So stuff like, I will do it. If somebody says to you, I will do it, how do you know what they really mean? So in some geographies and in some cultures, it just means that I will work on this. Mostly in Scandinavia, it means that I will get it done, right? I will do it. I will finish it completely, hand it over, and you can use it. And another good example is if somebody tells you to do it or get it done, then how do you perceive that? Do you perceive that as bossy, commanding kind of tone? Or do you perceive that as your colleague asking you to do something for him? So this kind of differences in perception and differences in understanding occasionally creates friction between teams, but also impacts their team's performance a lot. So let's take a bit more complex example. I want to start off with a dilemma, a situation that has multiple equally good or equally bad options for you to choose. So the dilemma I'm asking you to kind of think of would be the following. So you have a friend with whom you work with. He's sitting next to you each and every day, and one day there's a code review coming in, and he just needs to leave early. He's saying that, oh, I don't want to do that. I'm gonna just pass it okay, and he leaves, right? And this creates some financial damage, and from that there's an issue raising, and your friend's manager and also your manager is coming to you and asking, did he really do the code review? Because the bug was so obvious, he would have noticed it. So what do we do in this kind of situation? So we have a few options. The one option would be to lie for the sake of friendship and say, yeah, he actually did the code review, and I don't know how that bug was missed, right? Another option would be to tell the truth. And if we think of cultures, there really isn't any culture that doesn't value friendship. So the first option seems legit, but also does the other option, because there is no culture that doesn't value truth. So these are both opinions or options to choose from, and neither of them are especially a good one. But surprising fact here is that people usually lean toward one or another option. If I would ask you to raise your hands, it wouldn't be like all of you would vote for one and the same option. So people are somewhat divided. And to understand why is that so, or where does this kind of bias come from? So we're all biased to some sort of one choice here. Where does this bias come from? I went in and started to look into models of cultural dimensions. And this is because if we have this sort of misunderstanding or different understanding for simple words, we usually develop some sort of gut feeling. So if we work long enough with another team and we hear constantly that I will get it done, and we know that this really means that they will just work on it, then eventually we will develop a gut feeling to understand what's actually behind that phrase. But what we don't understand is, why is that so? Why can't he just say that I will work on this, and you will probably won't get it done? So a few years back I attended a conference that was talking about models of cultural dimensions. I got fairly excited about this and started to think about this when working with distributed teams, and started to look into the kind of scientific research on this as well. So it appears that there is two main or mostly well-known models out there. So one of them is developed by Hofstede, and it has been developed already quite a while back. It was built in the end of 60s and then beginning of 70s. It was a survey-based research, and he only used IBM employees for this survey. So this is kind of seen as a good sign, because there are far less these kind of things that could affect the results, like some other cultures. So it was all done in the same organizational culture, the research. And another one was built by Trompenaars, and this has 7 dimensions. And it doesn't mean that Trompenaars just added one. He pretty much redefined how these cultures should be modeled or designed. And he had a significant amount of people contributing to the survey as well, and it was also survey-based. So I want to start off with a kind of more recent one. Trompenaars built it or published it in the end of 90s, based on the 10 years of research he had done. And it can be perceived as a more modern approach, but I see it as just a different take on these cultural dimensions. So the dilemma we used before, I showed you in the beginning, Trompenas actually used similar dilemmas to kind of do the survey. And one of the dilemmas Trompenas actually used was this one. So it's a very similar dilemma with slightly different context. So it goes pretty much like that. There was an accident. You were sitting in the passenger seat. You most probably saw the speed that your friend was driving with. And now you're summoned to a court to testify either your friend was driving within the speed limit or exceeding speed limit, right? So what do? Either you lie for your friendship or you tell the truth. And I'm showing this dilemma here because for this specific dilemma, there is clear statistics out there and available as well. It appears that over 90% of people from Switzerland, USA, and Sweden would tell the truth. They would believe, over 90% of people would believe that their friend has no right to believe or hope that you would lie for your friend, right? But in Korea and Venezuela, it's less than 40%. So over 60% in Korea and Venezuela would say that they would lie for their friendship. Even this kind of statistics can be perceived differently. So people from USA might look at the statistics and say, how can you trust Korea? Because they're always helping out their friends. They're corrupt. And on the contrary, people in Korea or Venezuela look at USA or Sweden and say, how can you trust them? They won't even help their friends. So it's these kind of contradicting points of views, and true value or kind of understanding comes from the fact where two of these actually meet or kind of reconcile in the middle somewhere. So this was one of the dilemmas that was used to specify this kind of preference with this dimension. So universalism versus particularism. Trompenas divides cultures quite strictly within these multiple dimensions between two categories. So cultures lean more towards either universalism or more towards particularism. It doesn't say how much they lean towards one or another, but it describes what sort of implications this thing has. So cultures that are universalist, more universalistic, tend to have high importance on laws and rules. So laws apply to everybody equally. There is no such thing that, depending on context or circumstances, the rules may apply differently. And it also plays a big role in fairness and equality in these kind of situations that, for example, getting a promotion, everybody should have the equal opportunity for that. In particularistic cultures, relationships have really high value. And all of these kind of rules can be bent according to circumstances. So if we take this to the software development teams, then, for example, doing a release has a specific process in place. So we're doing a fix, it goes through a CI pipeline, possibly it goes into performance testing, then maybe some sort of regression testing pipeline, eventually it reaches a production. So how okay, or is it okay to bend this kind of process if we need to do a really, really quick fix? Just like, yeah, we're kind of changing some label maybe, or something really small that doesn't affect the functionality. So in universalistic cultures, this sort of situation should be handled equally with extremely large releases. So they usually lean more towards the decision of, no, we should kind of follow through all the process and release it in a normal way. But in the particularistic cultures, this situation may be seen as an extreme circumstance that in turn gives permission to bend these rules, right? So, but this is only kind of one dimension. Universalistic cultures, for example, are USA, Germany, Sweden, France, Japan, Estonia, Lithuania, in turn are more particularistic cultures. So Japan is definitely very, very particularistic. So USA, Germany, Sweden are on the left side and others were on the right. Okay. So Trompe has defined 7 of these kind of dimensions. And I won't be covering all of them. You will have a fantastic chance of going off and doing a lot of reading on this or looking it up on YouTube about what all of these dimensions mean and what's actually behind these things. But most of the kind of data for these dimensions was collected by using these kind of dilemmas, like presenting a series of dilemmas and asking people to choose one or another option. Okay. Interesting one here. I'm gonna talk briefly about internal direction versus outer direction, and then about sequential time versus synchronous time. So internal and external direction pretty much implies how much people believe they can influence their own environment around them. Cultures with outer direction feel that they have little control over the environment, so they try to adopt it. And for software development teams, again, I've seen that developers in cultures with outer direction tend to be more focused around their own projects. So they are learning deep those technologies that are within their projects because they have a belief that there's not much that they can do to influence that set of technologies, so they should adopt as much as possible to that specific set. On the other side, cultures with internal direction explore a lot of technologies, even those that they know they possibly never gonna use in their project, but they have more of this kind of exploratory nature. So this was internal direction versus outer direction. Sequential time versus asynchronous time was another especially interesting one for me. So this dimension defines how people manage time and perceive time. Sequential cultures want to have things happen in sequences, obviously. So things have a very strict beginning and end. Project plans should be fairly well defined. They want them to have well defined, and wasting time is not tolerated. So it's kind of if I'm attending a meeting and my customer or another developer possibly is late 15 minutes, then my time is wasted. So I feel bad about this. On the other side, there is synchronous understanding of time. And these kind of synchronic cultures, their people are more flexible about the time. So past, present, future are all intertwined. They don't have the feeling of wasting time. So a story of this came to me when I was working in the project for Nigeria. There was an integration we needed to do with an external financial company. And since that integration required a lot of kind of SOAP communication, undocumented XML formats, some sort of encryption on top of that, we decided that let's have our developer fly in there sit down with the developer of that financial institution, and they can figure these things out together. So our developer flies in, arrives at the customer's office, just to learn that the developer who he was supposed to meet decided to work from home on that day. So it was kind of like, what's happening? But they were still communicating in Skype and trying to do the efforts that they were intended to. And the same thing happened on the second morning. So it was really surprising, and that was the point when we escalated and told that, hey, we really need that developer to be on site, sitting next to our guy to work out these issues. And finally, yeah, he arrived and everything got sorted out. But the thing was that the developer in Nigeria didn't feel that something was wrong. They were still doing work. He was just decided to work from home on that day. But our developer and we as well in Estonia felt that, hey, it's kind of a waste of time. Like, he's there and could work much more efficiently, but he's not. So an afterthought of this is that maybe we should have this kind of manage the expectations better to kind of clarify that our developer comes there and we expect another developer to sit on the site with him. So this kind of clarification was required at that point, but we did not use that option. So sequential cultures are USA and Germany, for example, and synchronous cultures are Africa and most of Middle East. So in Middle East, it's also kind of a possibility that you agree a meeting with a customer or another vendor, and you send that invite to two developers or two people, and it happens that the other party arrives like half an hour later, not letting you know that they will be late, and they have, instead of 2 persons, they have like 5 or 7 with them. So now you need to kind of change the meeting rooms and kind of rearrange everything. But for them it's okay, because the meeting was arranged, the meeting happened, and the agreed people were there, just not at the same time, not with the same volume as initially agreed with. So I don't know, and that's the kind of tricky part with the model, with the Trompenaars model, that there isn't too much of this data available, what sort of cultures these countries are. There is a bit, because he didn't have the opportunity to have the study as worldwide as Hofstede did. So he has some blank areas. I'm sure Spain is in there, so if you look that up, then you will probably find it out. Okay, so this covers Trompenaars' model. So Hofstede had 6 dimensions of culture, and this is an early model and considered the kind of foundation of these kind of cultural dimensions. As I said, it was published in the end of 60s, beginning of 70s, but this doesn't mean that it's worthless now. It still applies, and there have been recent studies about how these values or how these dimensions have changed. Hofstede tried to put everything on a scale from 0 to 100. So there was a kind of more specific scale available than Trompenaars had. And there are studies how these indexes or values have changed over time. And it appears that they change, yes, but they change together. So if we compare Estonia to USA, then the kind of relative positioning of these dimensions still is the same. Yes, and I especially wanted to put this other model out there here as well, because I see this very much as architecture. So in software architecture, you never get away with one view. You need to have multiple views of your software. You need to have component view, network view, deployment view, and then you get some sort of comprehensive view of what this thing is about. And since these kind of cultural dimensions is a fairly complex thing, it requires this kind of similarly multiple views to be represented. So Hofstede had 6 views, and I will be talking about, or 6 dimensions, and I will be talking about 3 of them. So I've cherry-picked the ones that I have some sort of experience with or have stories to relate to. And yes, and these 3 are. So first one is short-term versus long-term orientation. And this kind of by the title is pretty self-explanatory. But maybe the more interesting part is what sort of implications it creates for people within those cultures. So in short-term orientation, there's a lot of focus on short-term value or value creation in short-term. And when doing conflict resolution, these cultures tend to lean more into one or another extreme. There is more rare cases that a certain kind of middle way is chosen. In long-term orientation, there's a lot of kind of compromising, choosing middle way, thinking really long ahead. Now, if you think like, and this has really good statistics available as well about the kind of where different countries position within the scale of 0 to 100. So USA is fairly short-term oriented culture, as Estonia and Lithuania are on the far right. Even further right are Japan and Taiwan, for example, that really think about long-term much more than in short-term. So in software teams, how this applies. It's when I was working in USA, we had a bunch of conversations with other developers in other teams, and fairly common thing I heard and saw was that they were swimming in technical debt, and they wanted to fix that. They said that yes, I'm working on these and these projects, and I would like to fix these things like quite a lot. I don't like this implementation, or this technological choice is not good. It needs to be changed, but everything is moving so fast, so we don't have time for that. So in these cultures, if we think of a technical debt, that is usually a long impact thing. So we need to refactor something so it would be maintainable further in the future. But if on the other scale we have a business feature that has impact within next 2 months, and other side we have technical debt that has impacts in maybe next 2 years, right? So in these cases, managers lean towards the business value, and this is something I saw also when doing sales there. So in cultures with short-term orientation, it's very important to bring the short-term impact to the picture. So you need to talk about how this is going to change or impact you within the next 3 to 6 months. It doesn't matter if you're going to say that eventually we're going to feel pain and all the developers are going to leave us because they don't want to work on this project. But when does this going to happen? In a few years. Like, okay, but we can work until that time. We can work for a few years, and then we can do some changes later. So, but it also, for me, implies that USA often has multiple views of this kind of time. So they have the understanding of short-term impact and long-term impact. As of teams in Estonia, for example, these two things, like one technical depth story and business feature story, are much more on the same scale. So they value these things much more equally than cultures with short-term orientation. So I can't say that one is better than other, right? There is no such thing, but it's just the perception for this kind of time and preferences are different. So next one I want to talk about is power distance index. And this describes basically how societies handle or accept inequalities among people. So if there's a hierarchy in an organization, is it just accepted by people that this is in place and this should be in place, or people kind of challenge it? So do they ask a question, is my manager competent enough to be in that position? Or they just accept it, that since that person was assigned to be my manager, then he or she must be competent enough, right? So cultures with low power distance index, the most valuable thing a child can learn is independence. On the other hand, cultures with high power distance index, children learn respect before anything else. So when two adults are speaking or talking to each other, then children should not interrupt. That's the high power distance index side. And it is already learned from the very young age. On the other hand, when child wants to interrupt, probably these two adults will stay silent and listen what that child has to say, right? But this also affects how people prefer to have assignments put at their hands. So with cultures with high power distance index expect to be told fairly specifically what to do, what is expected from them. As of low power distance index side, people tend to believe that they know their own job the best. So they should be told what needs to be done, and they will find the most proper way to get this implemented. So the story with this is when I was doing recruitment in, let me just put this out here as well. So the scale is like this. Estonia is fairly close to Lithuania in this. We are usually fairly in the middle somewhere. So we have comparisons to either side. And the interesting fact I noticed as well was that Estonia and Lithuania are far more similar than Estonia is to Latvia, or Lithuania is to Latvia, that is, as well. And Estonia and Finland usually are not similar at all, even though we're just across water. So when I was doing this recruitment in USA, I had a candidate who reached the technical evaluation phase. And the candidate was actually fairly recently arrived from India, moved to USA, got the permit, and the test assignment I usually use there is fairly abstract. So I give them one Java class, one unit test. The Java class has a bunch of empty methods, and I tell them what I want this Java class to do. So it's not very specific. I just describe the business functionality, what I want that to do, what I want to achieve. So that candidate came in, sat down, I explained the game rules. They can use Google or call a friend, and described what I want them to do, what I want him to do. And he started looking around the code, got acquainted, but in general felt that he was quite confused about what he should be doing. So he ended up at some Java method that was obviously called by the unit test, but it was empty. So he turned to me and asked, is this that I should be kind of filling in? So I intentionally wanted to be very ambiguous at this point and said that, I don't know, like do whatever. I want this thing to work. I want this thing to do the kind of business thing, right? And that, of course, made him even more confused because he didn't know what he was expected to do, what he needed to do, on what basis he's being evaluated at this point. So, but I wasn't able to tell him that I'm looking at clean code, I'm looking at code structure, understanding of Java, etc., etc. So that's a really long list, and this kind of ambiguous assignment has helped me to cover different facets of development. So he implemented that code, and sometime later he turned to me again, found another method, and asked pretty much the same question. Is this something I should be completing? And at that point I understood that this thing does not work. Not for me, not for him. And I asked him to take the assignment, and I gave him very clear goal. The goal was to get certain test cases passing. So this is kind of provided data, and let him do this thing offline, because probably I introduced myself as head of engineering as well, and it might have had an influence on his performance. So eventually he sent me back the results, the code he had written. It was good, it was way above my expectations, but we eventually didn't hire him because he wasn't good enough. But I was fairly certain that he wouldn't send me back anything, because he just didn't feel like he understood anything when we were doing this kind of one-on-one observed programming style assignment. But this is kind of the thing that I initially didn't understand. I was behaving just I was doing recruitment in Estonia or Lithuania. I was doing the recruitment there with people that had huge variety of cultural backgrounds and huge variety of these kind of biases from these indexes and dimensions. So the next one, the last one here, is uncertainty avoidance. So this dimension focuses on how cultures adapt and cope with uncertainty. It's not about staying away from uncertainty, but it's how we behave or what kind of actions we take to avoid uncertainty. So, for example, very high in this index is Japan. They have very high uncertainty avoidance, and they have a lot of rituals in place. So you should always give a gift with two hands and receive a gift with two hands. You should never open a gift when the giver is present. And the reason is, what if you don't like the gift? And then you will make the other person uncomfortable who gave you the gift. So let's just not open it here. I'll open it later, and he won't see my expression when I take it out of the box, right? So this is kind of how these cultures, what kind of systems they have developed to kind of avoid uncertainty. So cultures with low uncertainty avoidance, it's very okay for teachers or also for me as a conference speaker to say that I don't know. If you have a question and I say I don't know, I don't feel bad, and you probably don't feel that you have insulted me. In certain cultures, there was this article about some coaching session where a person from Japan said that he would never ask anything from his manager if he wouldn't be certain that his manager knows the answer. So I don't know if he knows the answer, so I'm not going to ask that question, just in case. But in low uncertainty avoidance cultures, it's very, very okay to ask such questions. But on the other hand, the high uncertainty avoidance, everything is ritualized, very high detailed plans is required. So on this scale, pretty much everything is leaning towards right. Usually it's said that cultures with high uncertainty avoidance are very diligent workers because they want to do everything that's possible to avoid mistakes, to avoid kind of bugs. They are very thorough in everything. And on the very left side here is actually Singapore. And then there's a lot of blank space, and then there's China. Okay, so Norway. Yes. So they probably have a kind of a set of rules, but they tend to balance between these two. So as I said, the specific score is not relevant here. But if we compare, for example, Norway to Lithuania, we can say that if we're from Lithuania or from Estonia, that's also close to Lithuania. In that case, we can, and going to Norway or talking with teams in Norway, we can expect them to be more, we can expect them to be less uncertainty avoiding than we ourselves are. So, for example, in development processes or development projects, there's often different changes that need to be implemented. In architecture, introducing new technologies or changing the development process. So when we're talking, for example, with Serbia, it's much higher chance of succeeding if we have these detailed analysis and plans in place. So we kind of overplan everything, and that gives them confidence that this uncertainty that's introduced by this change is not gonna blow up everything. On the other hand, if we're talking with Norway, for example, it might be enough to say that we feel that this change is needed. So as an authority, we kind of, our feelings and belief that this is needed may be sufficient to reason why this is actually needed. So it's all about this kind of relative positioning of these things. Okay. This is apple and this is orange. They're both fruits, but still they're not the same, right? They grow in the same place, but they're not the same. So don't step into a stereotyping trap. Each person is different. You shouldn't put any expectations on them based on the kind of culture they come from. But furthermore, there are also subcultures within geographies. And these subcultures may come from different organizations, even different roles within organization, probably have different values in terms of these indexes. So managers and project managers probably have a different uncertainty avoidance kind of level or acceptance to uncertainty than developers do. So developers are very happy to say that, yes, let's take on that new technology, that's fine. We kind of have a feeling that it's good. It was shown on Nortal Tech Radar, it's all good, let's go with it. But managers want to have more detailed plan to get that accepted, right? So it's a tool. For me, these dimensions is a tool that can be used to lead your own expectations. For me, working in a distributed team without these kind of understanding of these dimensions is like debugging an issue without access to a server, logs, debugger, anything. So you just see the problem in web, you go to code, you try to do something, you kind of have a hunch, maybe we can try this, change this value, you do a new deployment, you try again, it still fails, right? Or it succeeds, and you get kind of, by luck, you hit the right point or change the right code. But this gives you tools, it gives you thoughts or ideas that you can keep in back of your head and think about. Maybe this situation happened because the person I was talking to has higher uncertainty avoidance than I personally do have. So maybe I should plan it out more step by step for that person and describe why this change is actually needed. Should provide long-term impact description or short-term impact description? Should I provide maybe both? So this is kind of a thing that it helps me to figure out. Thank you.